Here is one of the two most filmed streets in Łódź, Roosevelt Street. It was laid out in the 1880s and it was intended to provide convenient access to the Evangelical Augsburg Church at Sienkiewicz Street, today's Jesuit church. Anyway, at the time the street was called Ewangelicka. It was only after the Second World War that the American president Franklin Delano Roosevelt became its patron. The owner of the plot of land and today's Roosevelt 17 address was Konrad Haessner, a Łódź-based industrialist active in the chemical industry. To design the building, Haessner collaborated with the leading Łódź architect Gustav Landau Guttentegger. At the address mentioned above, a luxurious neo-Baroque tenement house was created with a richly decorated facade and sumptuous interiors, which, thanks to the meticulous renovation in recent years, we can still admire today. Today, the building is the seat of the House of Literature in Łódź. It is here, in the gate clearance, that we meet the protagonist of the series People and Gods, directed by Bodo Kox. We move to Warsaw in 1941. Members of the liquidation squad of the Home Army, counterintelligence, are gathering before a planned action. Their task is to execute death sentences on Polish traitors and blackmailers. This time, Igo Sym, a Polish-Austrian actor who collaborated with the Nazis, played by Lesław Żurek, is sentenced to death by a hood court operating at the Union of Armed Struggle. Sym's assistant, Stanisław Rzeszot, played by Sebastian Perdek, visits him just before his execution. Distraught and full of bad feelings, he shows him a threatening letter. Sym, lying in negligee on a luxurious bed in his suit, completely ignores his assistant's fears. At this time, Lieutenant Leszek Zaremba, alias Onyx, played by Jacek Knap, who is in the charge of the execution, is standing at the gate, just at 17 Roosevelt Street, with other members of the unit. One of them is still missing, Corporal Tadeusz Korzeniowski, alias Dagger, played by Dawid Dziarkowski. They watch the entrance to the tenement across the street from Sym's flat. Without waiting any longer, Onyx decides to proceed. So the men cross the street. One of them, disguised as a postman, knocks on the door of the actor's flat, while the other insures him by standing to the side. The landlady opens the door and wants to collect the dispatch from Berlin herself, but the pretended postman says he will only hand it over with a signature, what means in his own hand. He goes inside and closes the door behind him. A moment later, a shot rings out. Alarmed by the sound, a man in a German uniform emerges from a neighboring apartment into the stairwell. However, when he sees that the Polishman covering the action is holding him at a gunpoint, he gives up and retreats to his flat. As befits an actor, there is a great deal of theatricality in Igo Sym's death. He dies from a gunshot to the head to the accompaniment of an aria from the opera Pagliacci, and the feathers floating in the air from the shot pillow add a certain irrationality to the whole scene. While the members of the troupe do not quite match their historical prototypes, Igo Sym was an authentic character. He was handsome, so he mainly played roles of boss. In one German production, he even partnered Marlene Dietrich herself. In the 1930s, he became involved in Polish revue theaters. When silent cinema gained sound, Sym was casted mainly in supporting roles, probably due to the fact that he never mastered the Polish language flawlessly. When the Second World War broke out, he took part in the civilian defense of the city, digging anti-aircraft ditches, extracting people from under the rubble. However, as the investigation showed, already in the end of 1939, he proposed to the occupant to rebuild Warsaw's theater community. The propaganda office of the general government put him in charge of the Theater der Stadt Warschau and in charge of the Helgoland cinema. He was investigated by the actor and director of the Komedia Theatre, Roman Niewiarowicz, an officer of the Polish underground. On March 5, 1941, the Special Court of the Union of Armed Struggle passed a death sentence on Sym. Initially, it was planned to poison him, which would have been more difficult to detect and thus reduce the risk of repression. However, in the end, the order was given to execute, noting that it was a strong shock, proof that the Polish underground was active. After the death of Igo Sym, terror increased, especially against the artistic community. Although it is not shown in the TV series, we know from history that in retaliation the Germans arrested around 130 people, including the well-known theater actor Stefan Jaracz and the director, theater critic and educator Leon Schiller, who is the patron of the film school in Łódź. They were first imprisoned in the Pawiak prison and later transported to Auschwitz-Birkenau camp. Fortunately, both managed to leave the camp. Jaracz was released after numerous interventions, while Schiller was bailed out of the camp by his sister Anna Jackowska. Returning to the series, the Second World War is one of the periods that most strongly inspires filmmakers. Although it is an exceptionally cruel time, the multitude of plots helps to create a fascinating story. The main equal characters are two home army soldiers, Onyx and Dagger, who manage to escape from a transit camp. When they get to Warsaw, they become members of a unit named Pazur. The execution of death sentences handed down by the court of the Polish underground makes them masters of life and death, which is doubly dangerous. On the one hand, every action, even if prepared in the smallest detail, always contains some element of unpredictability. On the other hand, the right to take another person's life gives them power in which it is easy to lose oneself. They are both like fire and water, apparent opposites, yet complementary like pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. The series convincingly conveys the atmosphere of omnipresent horror and terror of the occupation period. You never know who you can trust or whether you will return home when you leave, and an accidental roundup or hitting a German officer in the street will not end with imprisonment in the Pawiak prison or death. The director, Bodo Kox, who comes from independent cinema, approached the subject in an innovative way in the context of other Polish productions on the same subject. It is worth noting the cinematography, unusual perspectives, illusions depicting narcotic delusions or the protagonist's fears. It is worth mentioning that in the history of Polish cinematography, Roosevelt 17 is most strongly inscribed with a scene of Andrzej Wajda's film and TV series Ziemia Obiecana, Promised Land. Here, Moritz Welt appears, who after a difficult conversation with Grunspan, comes down the stairs, takes off his coat, sits down and unexpectedly looks directly into the camera. Breaking the so-called fourth wall, which is the conventional barrier between actor and audience, he smiles and waves to the viewer. Let's imagine him for a moment and wave back.